All right, so we're going to continue on now with our next section on population ecology. And so what we're going to start moving into next is a discussion of life history. And life history can kind of be thought of as a strategy that a population or a species or an organism uses to get through its life and leave behind the most offspring. In other words, maintain the highest fitness possible. So we can look, for example, at the relative expense of producing offspring, right? Offspring are expensive. Obviously, for humans, that's the case, but for any species, it takes time and it takes energy and it takes effort to produce offspring successfully. So if you look in an environment, for example, when resources are limited, then there's going to be an even more of a premium placed on offspring production because they're going to be even more of a relative expense. If there aren't that many resources around and you're trying to reproduce more of yourself, those offspring are going to be especially valuable to you as an individual. In other words, for each offspring, they're going to represent a greater overall chunk of your fitness, right? So this would be an environment where you have, say, for example, a lot of competition, right? You've got a lot of competition for resources. There's a lot of other individuals around. It's going to be absolutely critical that you produce offspring in the most efficient way possible to maximize your fitness. And so in this case, we're talking about organisms that are very competitive and also organisms that make good use of the resources they do have and not waste resources. If, on the other hand, you have an environment where resources are not limiting, and it might be difficult to think about that being the case, but there actually are some environments where resources are not a limiting factor, and that could be in a place where perhaps you've just had a disturbance and most species have been wiped out, leaving not much in the way of life behind. Those few species that survive or those species that colonize right after the disturbance are going to have relatively lack of competition, relatively unlimited resources, at least for a while, to reproduce. And so for them, when resources are not limiting, then the cost of reproduction per individual offspring is relatively low. And so for those two different types of environments, these two different strategies, we're going to see a variety of different life history adaptations. When resources are limiting, typically reproductive output is going to be relatively low. You're not going to try to produce as many offspring because you may not have the resources to produce a lot. This is going to be what we call a K-selected species or a K-selected population. These species are those that are limited by the carrying capacity of the environment. Right? We talked about carrying capacity previously in the past couple of sections, but just to remind you, carrying capacity is the number of individuals of a species that an environment can support indefinitely or sustainably. If the environment has a lot of competition, then the carrying capacity is going to come into play and affect how many of a given species you're actually going to find. If the carrying capacity is not at play, then we'd be dealing with more of what you would call an R-selected species that would tend to show up right after a disturbance and colonize it relatively quickly. So in this situation, we have populations that are relatively small. Again, perhaps it's a result of a disturbance. Maybe it's a result of species colonizing right after a disturbance. There's going to be a lot of resources around. Cost of reproduction is going to be relatively low. And so now we're going to be dealing with what we call R-selected populations. R-selected populations are species whose numbers are limited not by resources, because resources, for all intents and purposes, might as well be unlimited in this environment. They're not limited by resources, but instead they're limited by their own reproductive biology. Remember, we saw R in the previous section. R is a measure of the intrinsic growth rate of a population, and if resources are unlimited, the only thing limiting a population from reproducing more is that population's own inherent ability to reproduce. And so we call those R-selected species. Right? So what we're dealing with here is a continuum. On one hand, you have what are called R-selected species that are limited only by their own physical growth rate. And on the other hand, we have species that are limited by their environment. And those are two very, very different things. So we have a continuum from R-selected to K-selected species, and most species are going to fall somewhere in between the two ends of that continuum. All right, so again, life history is kind of a descriptive way to represent what goes on in the life of an organism throughout its entire life, from the day that it's born, or the day that it hatches, or the day that it germinates, whatever it's doing, until the day that it dies. Right? So we can look at different life history strategies, like in this picture here on the bottom right. This is a type of desert plant. We see it growing actually in more of a suburban setting in this case. But this entire thing here, it looks like a tree. This entire thing here, which is probably at least 20 or 30 feet tall, is actually a flower stalk. This is all flower stalk up here, and the actual plant itself is kind of hidden behind the green here, but it's actually this part in the background. That's the actual plant. And it takes this plant maybe 15 or 20 years to accumulate the resources it needs to produce a flowering stalk that's that enormous. And they call this actually Big Bang reproduction, because what they do here is these particular plants, they put everything into producing that flowering stalk. Every last little bit of resource, nutrient, energy, everything they have is put into and is devoted to producing that flowering stalk. And at that point, after they flower, after they reproduce, they die immediately afterwards because they just simply have nothing left to put into it. So we're going to look at different types of life history strategies that have to do pretty much with two major factors here. Number one is the longevity of a species or the lifespan of a species, and number two is how many offspring it produces in a given, not necessarily year, but time interval, because some species don't live for years, obviously. They're going to live for hours or days or weeks or months. But per time interval, how many offspring does it produce? And depending on the longevity of the species and depending on how many offspring it produces, that's going to kind of put it into one of our two categories of being either R selected or K selected. So we're going to go through now and look at some different types of traits you might associate with R selected or K selected species. This is a really good graph that kind of shows you that positive correlation between mortality and number of offspring per year. And we see here as mortality rate per year increases from maybe 5% all the way up to 100% mortality, the number of offspring per year also increases. So the greater your chance of dying in this current given year that you're living in, the more you're going to tend to devote to producing offspring. It makes no sense to try to wait until next year if 75 or 100% of your population is going to die now. Odds are against you. So you'd be better off from a natural selection and fitness standpoint to reproduce as much as you can now, because in all likelihood you're not going to be around next year anyway. And that's a fairly common thing that we see in nature, is this trade-off between mortality versus number of offspring. The resources, the reproduction you have to put in it, there's very much a trade-off here. We talk a lot about trade-offs in natural selection. This idea of do you save resources and try to reproduce multiple times throughout your lifespan, or do you put everything into this one current reproductive event now with the idea that you're probably not going to last very long in the future? And again, I want to stress here that organisms are not going through a conscious process here to try to figure out the pros and cons of waiting versus reproducing now. This is a natural selection thing, right? So if you were to go back, 500,000 years and look at a population of species, it was made up of two different types of strategies. Some organisms try to wait to reproduce next year, even though most of them never survive until next year, versus others who reproduce all this year and then die anyway. Which of those two strategies might be favored? Well, it should be the second one, right? If you're waiting to reproduce past a point in time where you're not going to survive anyway, then that energy that you're saving is wasted. Versus if your mortality rate is high, and for those that reproduce anyway as much as they can, their genes are going to be favored. So over the course of many generations, that particular species would be inclined to reproduce as much as it can early, because in all likelihood it's not going to be around anyway in the future. We can also look at trade-offs in current versus future investment as well. If we take a look here, in this graph here is actually showing a cost of reproduction in terms of clutch size. In this context, a clutch means a group of eggs. So birds like clutches of eggs and reptiles like clutches of eggs. So the change in clutch size, you can either keep the same one that you had last year, you can decrease it by 1 or 2 eggs, or you can increase it by 1 or 2 eggs. You can then see from this current change in clutch size what could be predicted to occur in the following year. So if you were to decrease your clutch size this year, then that's going to select for increasing clutch sizes next year. You're going to have maybe 7 eggs next year versus 6.5 eggs on average if you don't change it at all. Or if you try to increase your clutch size now, you can see what that's going to do to clutch size next year. It's going to drop you down to maybe 5.5 or 6 eggs per individual on average in the next year. Right? So you can't make unlimited offspring. There's a limit, and what you do now is going to affect what happens later on in your life as well when it comes to reproduction. So trade-offs are big in natural selection. We see a balance also between the number of offspring you produce versus the size of the offspring you produce, the quality of the offspring you produce. We talk a lot about quantity over quality or quality over quantity, depending on what kind of species you're looking at. If you produce a lot of offspring, chances are no one offspring is going to be all that big. If you don't produce that many, then you can devote more resources per offspring and make them all bigger. Which of those two strategies is better is dependent on what kind of environment you're living in. If you're living in a fairly stable environment that's maybe not all that harsh, you're probably better off to make a lot of offspring, because chances are they might all survive, or at least most of them might survive. On the other hand, if you're living in a really harsh, extreme environment, you probably want to make fewer offspring, but equip them better, make them bigger, make them stronger, make them healthier, and give them each the best shot at survival. So, in some environments, you might want to have a clutch of 12 or 13 or 14 eggs. What that does to the size of the offspring, though, is it makes them all relatively small, somewhere between 17 and a half and 18 grams individually, or per nestling bird. If you produce a smaller clutch size, now they're going to be on average, we're looking at maybe 2 grams apiece or more bigger per offspring, which is a huge difference. 2 grams is huge when you're dealing with only a 19-gram bird. That's an enormous change. So it's quantity over quality. Larger offspring, you have more shot at survival, but if you produce more offspring individually because they're smaller and perhaps inherently weaker, they might have a individually lower survival rate, but because you're producing more of them, maybe you have one or two that gets to that good environment and colonizes it and actually does succeed. So there's a very much a trade-off here, and very much a type of even though it's unconscious, a type of gamesmanship involved with trying to figure out the best strategy for, in this case, reproduction. We can also look at age at first reproduction and lifespan. Those things that reproduce really early on tend to be the ones that don't live all that long. For species that live longer, they tend not to reproduce as much early on, and you kind of see the advantage of that. It gives you more resource and more opportunity to grow and find food and get big and strong and those kinds of things. But for that to work, for the delayed reproduction to work, there has to be at least somewhat of a chance that you might survive until those later periods of time when you can reproduce. If you wait too long to reproduce and you die, then the genes you carry for that behavior are selected against. So there has to be a reasonably good assurance of survival if a species is going to wait. The advantage, of course, is growth. The disadvantage is the longer you wait, the more likely you are to die before you reproduce and then have your genes removed from the gene pool, which for natural selection is certainly not a good thing. Short-lived species, again, they tend to reproduce earlier because they're going to tend to not be around anyway in the future. All right, so we have on this slide and the next slide both a bunch of traits or features or characteristics of both R-selected and K-selected species. The first one we're going to look at is homeostatic ability. So how good is the individual at maintaining internal homeostasis? R-selected species tend to be relatively small. They tend to be those that live in environments that are fairly open, environments that don't have a lot of competition. They're not going to be the biggest or most well-developed organisms, so their homeostatic ability is going to be relatively low, in part because they're not going to live very long anyway. The chances of them living to a point where conditions change greatly is probably pretty slim. But for a K-selected species, they need to be able to maintain homeostasis over the long term, even if the environment's changing a lot. So they're going to have more ability to maintain temperature or pH or chemical homeostasis in their bodies. If we look at development time, how long it takes to go from hatchling or nestling or infant or newborn to adult, R-selected species tend to develop very quickly. K-selected species take longer, and that's okay because they have time. Right? They have time, they have perhaps parental care to help make sure the offspring survive and mature, so longer development time is okay. Lifespans for R-selected species, as you'd probably predict, are relatively short, and for K-selected species, they tend to be longer. If you look at mortality rate in any given point in time, R-selected species tend to have a higher mortality rate, K-selected species tend to have a lower mortality rate. If we look at how they reproduce, R-selected species tend to be asexual, and K-selected species often are sexually reproducing species. This one is a bit more of a gray area because there are certainly R-selected species that can reproduce sexually, and there are K-selected species that also reproduce asexually. So it's not a given sort of a thing that's always going to be this way, but you can see, for example, why asexual might be preferred in R-selected species. If they're the colonists showing up after a big disturbance, there might not be very many other members of their species around, so it would behoove them then to be able to reproduce with themselves. That's going to be a benefit for them living in an environment where you have a very low population size. On the other hand, a K-selected species living in a really competitive environment where there's a lot of fighting over resources and so forth, if they can produce offspring that are genetically variable, which is the big benefit of sexual reproduction, then those offspring might have a better shot genetically at surviving and doing well in their environments. If we look at the age of the first brood, a brood is like a batch of offspring, so we're looking at the age of first reproduction. R-selected species tend to reproduce really early. K-selected species tend to wait for reasons we talked about on the last slide. Our selected species, if they wait very long, chances are they're going to be dead, so it wouldn't make sense to wait to reproduce. K-selected species have a much higher survival rate, so they can go ahead and wait to reproduce until they're physically ready. If we look at the number of offspring per brood, our selected species tend to put more of their resources into their reproduction, so they're going to make more offspring very, very early on. K-selected species, they're going to spread it out. They're going to produce maybe one or two or a few offspring per reproductive event, but then have many of those events throughout their lifetime. So that's another kind of alternative strategy for R versus K selected. R selected species tend to produce small offspring, K selected produce larger offspring. So again, we're back to the idea of quantity versus quality. R selected species tend to be more of a quantity of offspring. K selected species tend to be more of a quality of offspring. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're healthier, and so forth. Parental care is often lacking or non-existent in R selected species. Very frequently, you're producing so many offspring, there's no way you could possibly take care of all of them. If you're producing a sea turtle making 120 eggs, there's no way a female could take care of all 120 of those offspring. Even if she stuck around, it would not be possible. Versus K selection, where you have a lot of parental care. So if you're looking at a primate or a carnivore that only makes one or a couple of offspring, polar bear or any sort of primate, one offspring you can keep up with. It might be a challenge, but you can keep up with one and take care of it and make sure it survives and it has the best shot possible at reproduction. Our selected species tend to disperse very widely. They've got a very high dispersal rate because, again, the way they're making a living is by colonizing habitats that have been recently disturbed or a fire has come through or a flood has come through. And so if they're going to find the next good habitat, they have to send a lot of their offspring out in all directions to try to find that next good habitat. We can look at the number dispersing. Again, kind of the same idea. R selected species tend to send out a bunch of offspring. K selected species, not so much. And then with dispersal mode, R selected species tend to be random. K selected species tend to have some way of orienting toward suitable or viable environmental cues so they can have the best shot possible at finding that next good habitat. So again, there aren't as many of them. They have to be better at finding the resources they need to exist. So the next thing to think about here is where we fall in. Where do humans fall in? So a lot of the traits we have are K-selected, relatively long-lived, relatively late age at reproduction. We don't produce that many offspring at once. We're sexually reproducing. A lot of the things we talked about in the previous two slides apply to humans, but one of the things that's kind of interesting is that historically we have acted more like an R-selected species. Since about the 1700s, we have been growing exponentially. Most populations, especially of large-bodied animals, tend to grow with that logistic or what we call an S-shaped population growth curve. Humans have not been that way. Since about the 1700s, we have been growing exponentially. By the end of the 1700s, there was about 1 billion people on the planet. It took the entire history of humans as a species to reach 1 billion individuals. And then after that time, since around the year 1800, we are up to now roughly 7.2 to 7.3 billion people. So we've increased drastically over the past, a couple hundred years. Dramatically increased our population size, almost more like a bacterial mode of growth than any other sort of animal or plant or anything like that, really. The things that have caused that to occur have been advances in sanitation, especially. It's one of the biggest ones. Also, increases in nutrition and medicine have also helped us to increase our population size by decreasing our death rates. Human birth rates haven't really changed very much in the grand scheme of things as a species, but death rates have gone down drastically from what they were, say, pre-1700s. So that's been the biggest cause of our more or less exponential population growth over the past couple hundred years. We can look at human population growth here. This is very much a J-shaped population growth curve. We're kind of cruising along at maybe a couple 100 million people for our entire history. And of course, we go back way before 4000 BC, but it's been pretty stable. We see bumps, we see drops. We see the bubonic plague or Black Death occurring back here, the Dark Ages. A bunch of people died over in Europe as a result of that. But then, all of a sudden, the population shoots up to upwards of actually more than 6, more like now 7 billion people kind of up here in this realm, off the graph, in fact. We can look at population sizes both relatively current in 2005 versus predicted in 2050, right, going from 900 million to 1.9 billion in Africa over the course of 45 years. We've got 5.3 billion people in Asia, up to 6.7 billion people in 2050. Sort of South Pacific is not going to change all that much because there aren't that many people there to begin with. Europe is actually going to go down some, which is maybe not a bad thing, 871 million to 767 million. North America might increase a little bit. South America is going to increase a little bit as well. But if you add up these numbers, this is a huge number of people that's projected to show up here in the next 20 or 30 years. So we're going to stop here, and I will start up with the next section talking about human population growth, and we should wrap up from there.